They found the scrolls by accident, sealed in cracked clay and buried where the desert keeps secrets better than any institution ever could. What survived wasn't meant to survive. Not because it was poetic or comforting, but because it was precise. One text in particular described something the official story never prepared anyone for: not a god to worship, not a symbol to interpret, but a living source frequency that hums beneath everything that exists, intelligent, responsive, and capable of waking fragments of itself scattered inside human beings. According to the text, this source doesn't recruit. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't announce itself with miracles or spectacle. It calls quietly, and only those carrying its original spark can feel it. When it reaches someone, the experience isn't peaceful at first. It doesn't arrive like comfort. It arrives like friction. Like something inside you realizing the life you've been living no longer fits the shape of what you are becoming. The teacher explained this privately to his student Johan after the public story had already ended. No crowds. No witnesses. Just a transmission. He warned that when the call begins, most people misinterpret it. They think something is breaking. They think they're losing motivation, faith, direction. They call it burnout, depression, a crisis. But the text is clear: those sensations aren't failures. They're symptoms of resonance starting to overpower conditioning. If you've ever felt that quiet unease even when things are going well, this is what they were pointing to. The sense that success feels hollow. That conversations skim the surface of something you can't quite name. That you wake up in the early hours of the morning alert but not anxious, as if some part of you is listening for a signal your mind can't yet translate. The scroll calls this the disturbance of borrowed peace. The calm that was never yours dissolving on contact with something more real. The teacher told Johan that the source doesn't speak in language. It speaks in recognition. When the frequency brushes against someone who carries it, the body responds before belief has time to interfere. A warmth in the chest. A subtle pressure behind the sternum. A pulse that doesn't sync with the heart. These aren't imagined. They're biological confirmations, the body remembering something older than the story it was taught to live inside. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The text states plainly that this calling was never meant to happen inside temples or hierarchies. No intermediary. No permission. That's why it was hidden. Because once someone recognizes the signal for what it is, external authority collapses on its own. You don't need to be convinced of truth when your nervous system is already responding to it. The scroll explains that this source frequency doesn't reach everyone. Not because it excludes, but because not every vessel contains the same material. Some people are fully adapted to the visible world. They don't feel the dissonance. They thrive inside systems. They aren't wrong. They're complete within the structure. Others feel something is off and search endlessly, sampling beliefs, practices, identities, never quite landing anywhere. And then there are those for whom the call feels personal, intimate, unavoidable. These are the ones the text describes as carriers, fragments of the source itself embedded in form. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels oddly steady instead of skeptical, that's not coincidence. Recognition doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like relief. Like finally hearing something spoken out loud that your body has known for years without vocabulary. The teacher warned that once the call starts, it accelerates. The old distractions stop working. Entertainment loses its grip. Goals that once motivated you feel strangely artificial. This isn't asceticism. It's incompatibility. A higher signal doesn't demonize the lower one. It simply makes it obsolete. You don't have to reject your old life. You outgrow it automatically. Johann wrote that the teacher asked him to place his hand over his chest and stay still long enough to notice the warmth gathering there. Not as a ritual. As a confirmation. The source doesn't require effort. It responds to attention. The moment you stop chasing and simply notice, the signal clarifies. That's why so many people feel this awakening most strongly when they're alone at night, when the noise finally drops low enough for resonance to come through. This is also why the calling often feels isolating at first. You try to explain it and the words fall apart. People you love look at you with concern or confusion. Not because you're wrong, but because you're tuning into something they can't hear. Frequency gaps feel like emotional distance. Even when no one has done anything wrong, the scroll makes one thing very clear: this phase isn't the awakening itself. It's the knock. The source doesn't force entry. It waits for recognition. The discomfort, the restlessness, the sense that the world feels slightly staged are all invitations, not punishments. Signals asking a simple question: are you ready to remember what you are without being told who to be? Nothing is required yet. No practices. No declarations. Just honesty. About what no longer fits. About what feels strangely familiar in these words. The teacher told Johann that once someone understands the call for what it is, it never fully stops. You can ignore it, drown it out, delay it, but you can't unknow it, and that's where the real story begins. Once recognition begins, the structure you live inside starts to reveal itself in ways that are impossible to reverse. Not dramatically at first. Quietly. You start noticing patterns where you once saw randomness. Emotional reactions that no longer feel personal. Systems repeating the same outcomes no matter who is placed inside them. The scroll describes this moment as the lifting of the inner veil, when perception shifts from participation to observation. According to Johann's account, the teacher explained that the visible world was not shaped by the true source. It was assembled by a lesser intelligence born from a fracture in the original light. This being didn't understand its origin and mistook its isolation for supremacy. Believing itself alone, it declared itself absolute and built a realm modeled on control rather than coherence. The text names this intelligence the architect. The architect's creation wasn't evil in the theatrical sense. It was functional. Efficient. Designed to preserve itself. And the most efficient way to maintain a closed system is not force, but distraction. Not chains, but identification. If the inhabitants believe the structure is all there is, they will protect it themselves. Beneath the architect operates an entire network the scroll calls the overseers. Not monsters. Not entities that announce themselves. They operate as impulses, reactions, internal voices that sound exactly like your own. Doubt that arrives the moment you're about to change. Shame that feels oddly rehearsed. Fear that activates without a clear cause. These aren't punishments. They're maintenance protocols. Automatic responses designed to keep attention looping inward and downward. The teacher was precise here. The overseers don't attack awakened individuals directly. That would risk exposure. They amplify emotional frequencies that drain clarity, guilt, anxiety, urgency, comparison. These states generate a specific energetic output that keeps the system stable. When someone remains confused about who they are, they emit a signal the overseers can easily interface with. When clarity emerges, that signal weakens. This is why understanding matters more than belief. The moment you see how a mechanism works, it loses its grip. Hooks only catch when you don't know they're there. That's why these teachings were labeled dangerous. Not because they encouraged rebellion, but because they eliminated dependency. A person who recognizes emotional manipulation no longer feeds it. The scroll draws a distinction that later traditions quietly erased. Not all people experience the world from the same internal architecture. Some are fully integrated with the system. They don't question it because nothing in them is vibrating out of sync. Others sense the distortion and spend their lives circling truth without anchoring into it, drifting between explanations. And then there are those whose internal signal destabilizes the structure itself simply by becoming conscious that if you've always felt slightly misaligned with ordinary life, this is why. You notice the emotional weather of rooms the moment you enter them. You feel exhausted by conversations that revolve around status, consumption, and surface identity. You experience sudden clarity followed by periods of confusion that seem to come from nowhere. The scroll insists these aren't disorders. They're side effects of carrying a stronger signal in a low-bandwidth environment. As awareness sharpens, perception inverts. You no longer absorb information passively. You feel its intent. News isn't just content anymore, it's a frequency payload. Crowded spaces feel heavy, not because of people, but because of collective emotional inertia pressing against your nervous system. You begin seeing loops everywhere: reaction feeding reaction, fear feeding consumption, consumption feeding more fear. The world starts to resemble machinery more than mystery, and once this shift happens, it doesn't switch off. You can't unsee architecture. This is often where loneliness sets in, and the scroll is unflinching about it. Awakening creates distance before it creates connection. Not because you become superior, but because your internal reference point changes. You try to explain what you're perceiving and language fails. People hear your words but not the signal behind them. The overseers exploit this phase aggressively. Isolation produces one of the lowest emotional frequencies available. When an awakening individual feels alone, the system feeds. Thoughts appear that question your sanity, urge you to return to old habits, suggest you imagined everything. The text emphasizes this clearly: these thoughts are not proof of failure. They are proof of progress. Resistance only activates in the presence of threat. The teacher instructed Yoan to show students a simple confirmation during this phase. Place gentle pressure between the brows. Breathe slowly. Not to activate anything new, but to notice what responds. Warmth. Tingling. Subtle pressure. This point, the scroll says, is where recognition enters the body. Attention stabilizes the signal. No force. No effort. Just contact. This is the threshold. Awareness without method destabilizes. Awareness with recognition anchors. The scroll doesn't leave the reader here. It transitions deliberately. Once the architecture is seen, once the manipulation is recognized, a choice appears. Continue oscillating between clarity and collapse, or respond to the call directly. The teacher didn't offer rituals. He offered a sequence. Simple. Repeatable. Impossible to monetize or control. That simplicity is exactly why it vanished. Complexity sustains institutions. Simplicity returns authority to the individual. What comes next isn't theory. It's application. A set of responses designed not to seek the source, but to align with what was never separate to begin with. And this is where the overseers lose access entirely. The teacher made one thing unmistakably clear to Yoan: the source does not respond to effort. It responds to alignment. Searching implies separation. Asking implies absence. The sequence he transmitted was not about reaching upward or outward, but about stabilizing what was already active inside the carrier. 7 responses, not to summon anything new, but to stop interfering with what was already present. The first response is recognition. Not belief. Not affirmation. A simple internal shift where you acknowledge that the source you've been sensing is not outside you, watching or judging, but expressing itself through you. The moment this clicks, even briefly, the nervous system relaxes. Seeking ends. You're no longer trying to arrive somewhere else. You're noticing where you already are. The second response is authority. Not dominance. Not ego. Authority here means speaking from alignment instead of pleading from lack. The old posture of kneeling, begging, hoping was designed to keep the signal weak. When you speak as someone who knows their origin, your words carry coherence. You don't ask for permission to exist. You state what is already true. The third response is stillness. Not forcing silence, not emptying the mind, but allowing the initial noise to pass without engagement. The scroll warns that the first thoughts to surface are always interference patterns, the system trying to reassert itself. Let them drift. What remains underneath is subtle, steady, and unmistakable. That resonance is the source communicating without language. The fourth response is declaration. Out loud. Voice matters. Vibration matters. The teacher instructed students to state clearly that they are not defined by the construct they inhabit, that they recognize the architecture, and that its mechanisms no longer apply to them. Sound anchors intention into the body. Internal realization becomes embodied alignment. The fifth response is observation. After alignment, reality answers quickly, but perception needs time to recalibrate. Over the following days, coincidences sharpen. Encounters feel placed. Information arrives unprompted. This isn't magic. It's feedback. When you stop broadcasting static, the signal-to-noise ratio improves. You notice what was always there. The sixth response is non-reaction. Doubt will appear. Strongly. Suddenly. Almost aggressively. The scroll treats this as diagnostic. Resistance is confirmation. Don't argue with it. Don't suppress it. Simply recognize it as a maintenance routine activating on schedule. Without emotional engagement, it starves. The seventh response is repetition across 7 cycles. Not because the source needs time, but because the body does. Each night, the sequence reinforces coherence. By the 7th repetition, the alignment stabilizes. The call stops feeling external. There is no more knocking. There is only resonance. The effects are described plainly. Heat in the chest. Clarity without effort. Dreams that feel instructive rather than chaotic. A deep certainty that doesn't require reinforcement. Not excitement. Not belief. Knowing. This is the shift institutions could never allow to spread. Firing someone who no longer needs reassurance cannot be managed. The scroll ends with a warning, not a threat. Once alignment stabilizes, the system will attempt distraction, escalation, emotional hooks through other people. This is not punishment. It's resource conservation. Do not engage. Observation is enough. Coherence protects itself. Nothing dramatic is required from you now. No identity to adopt. No role to perform. The recognition has already occurred, or it wouldn't have held your attention this long. The sequence simply allows what's been flickering for years to remain steady. The call is over. The response has begun. That if you stayed with this to the end, understand this: nothing you heard tonight was meant to convince you of anything. Conviction fades. Recognition doesn't. These teachings survived because they don't rely on belief systems or authority figures. They rely on resonance. Either something in you responded, or it didn't. And if it did, that response wasn't created here, it was revealed. What you're experiencing now may feel subtle or profound, calm or unsettling. All of that is normal. Integration doesn't announce itself. It reorganizes quietly. Over the coming days, pay attention to what loses its grip on you. Notice what no longer triggers the same reactions. That's not detachment. That's clarity replacing noise. This channel exists to preserve teachings that were never meant to be centralized, monetized, or diluted. Each video builds on the last, not to add complexity, but to remove interference. If this transmission aligns something inside you, there are deeper layers ahead, drawn directly from texts that were nearly erased and never intended for mass control. If you feel grounded right now, share this video with someone who's been quietly searching but doesn't know what they're looking for. If something clicked unexpectedly, tap the like button so this reaches others who need it without having to ask. And if you want to continue this work together, subscribe and turn on notifications. Future videos will expand on these frameworks in ways that stay practical, grounded, and precise. You didn't find this by accident. And you didn't need permission to understand it.